Arthur Dayne was not a man who gave himself to rage easily. From a young age, he had believed that honor was the highest calling, and that a knight's duty was to protect the weak and uphold the sacred vows of chivalry. All his life, he had been taught to be as noble as he was fearsome, channeling any darker instincts into the disciplined mastery of the sword. On the battlefield, he became the deadly artist they called the Sword of the Morning, whose skill with Dawn, his ancestral greatsword, was whispered about from Dorne to the Wall. Yet if there was one thing Arthur had always kept at bay, it was vengeance. When Robert's rebellion came to its gruesome conclusion and the Targaryen dynasty fell, Arthur's world also fell apart. But only in the months that followed did he discover a searing rage within himself that refused to be quelled. It was the rage of betrayal, the rage of loss, and the rage of a man who had taken vows to protect, yet found himself helpless to save Elia Martell and her children from the monstrous cruelty of Gregor Clegane. He had escaped death at the Tower of Joy through a series of events so improbable that Arthur sometimes wondered if the gods had intervened. He and his fellow Kingsguard Ser Oswell had held the tower against Eddard Stark and his men, while Ser Gerald Hightower had led the charge. They were outnumbered, but their skill was such that the skirmish turned into a deadly dance in which the desert wind was filled with the clangor of swords. One by one, Arthur saw his sworn brothers fall, and he himself received a devastating cut that nearly opened him from collarbone to hip. But before the final blow could be struck, one of Stark's men had recognized who Arthur was and hesitated. That single instant allowed Arthur to twist away, slay his attacker, and collapse into the dust. Eddard Stark, battered yet standing, bid his remaining men to give Arthur a chance to surrender. Arthur, too close to unconsciousness, barely remembered the words. He only remembered the grief, the guilt, the sense that he had failed his oaths in ways that no vow could ever repair. Eddard Stark, one of the most honorable men Arthur would ever know, insisted they bind Arthur's wounds rather than let him die. Another man might have demanded immediate execution. After all, Arthur was a Kingsguard, the loyal sword of a deposed king, and he had fought against them. But Stark could not bring himself to kill a wounded knight. If Arthur had been more alert, he might have asked Stark why. Perhaps it was because Stark remembered the way Ser Arthur had carried himself. Perhaps he recalled the tales of the Sword of the Morning's honor. Or perhaps it was simply in Eddard Stark's nature to offer mercy to a fallen foe. Over the next days, as Arthur was moved from the tower and cared for in a makeshift camp, Eddard spoke in hushed tones with him. Arthur did not speak much, for his wound was agonizing, and he had lost far too much blood to maintain long conversations. He was haunted by nightmares in which Princess Elia's screams merged with the roar of some hulking beast. When the delirium subsided, he realized these were half-memories gleaned from rumors, retold as fever dreams. He recalled the talk of Gregor Clegane's atrocities at the sack of King's Landing. Arthur could not accept that he had lived, while innocent children had been brutally cut down. It shattered the foundation of all his knightly ideals. He would have welcomed death, but Eddard Stark did not offer death. Eventually, though he was still weak, Eddard suggested Arthur travel south. "You have no place in these lands anymore, Ser Arthur," Stark said. "There is nothing left to fight for. The war is done and Robert is king." Arthur, in his weakened state, recognized that Robert Baratheon would not be pleased if he discovered a famed Targaryen loyalist still alive. He would certainly not look kindly upon the man who had once served as Rhaegar Targaryen's sworn sword. So Arthur took the last kindness Stark offered, a chance to fade into obscurity. The final time Arthur saw Stark, it was under the morning sun at the edge of the camp. The quiet Northman took him by the arm, pressed a small pouch of coins upon him, and said in the softest voice, "I would not have our last memory be a battle. Go in peace, Ser Arthur." And so Arthur left, a ghost of a man, clad in ragged clothes, carrying Dawn wrapped in a plain cloth bundle so that no one would recognize the legendary sword. He did not speak of his identity or his lineage, or that he had been the greatest swordsman of his age. Arthur traveled across Westeros in a lonely haze, at times not entirely certain why he bothered with life at all. Some days he felt resigned to a quiet existence. He considered going back to Starfall, to House Dayne, but a heavy shame prevented it. He could only imagine the grief in his sister Ashara's eyes if she saw him return, the living embodiment of all the tragedies that had befallen their family. Yet as the weeks turned to months, a single burning truth hardened his resolve to remain among the living: Elia Martell's final hours. He had been sworn to protect her, as she was the wife of Prince Rhaegar, but circumstances had drawn him away from King's Landing when the city fell. Reports of her death reached him only after Robert's victory was assured. They said Gregor Clegane had raped and murdered her, and that her children had been slaughtered. Her daughter had been a little girl, barely old enough to speak in complete sentences. The mountain had smashed her head against a wall. The horror of it all pressed upon Arthur's heart until it threatened to crush him. And so, in that gloom, a simple realization formed. If Arthur had nothing else to live for, he would live to see Gregor Clegane pay for his crimes. It was not an easy vow to keep in the immediate aftermath of the rebellion. Gregor Clegane became something of a favored brute in service to Tywin Lannister and, by extension, King Robert. The Lannisters had emerged from the war with considerable power, a result of their well-timed betrayal of the Targaryens. The mountain that rides was shielded by the might of House Lannister, and in the new order, few dared to question Tywin's methods. Arthur, alone and recovering, realized he had to become patient. He could not simply walk into the Red Keep or Casterly Rock and challenge the giant. He would be cut down by a swarm of Lannister guards or arrested and executed as a traitor. So he swallowed his rage and waited. He bided his time, finding work as a nameless sellsword in the disputed lands for a period, crossing the narrow sea to hide from the new king's justice. He spent more than a year across the ocean, drifting along the coastlines, hiring his sword out to merchant caravans, and searching for some measure of peace. Yet he found none. Every time he closed his eyes, Elia's ghostly face reminded him that he lived on borrowed time. He was a knight who had lost faith in knighthood, and so he returned to Westeros in secret, determined to keep his vow. When Arthur set foot on Westerosi soil once more, he began to gather information. Rumors said Gregor Clegane had been out raiding or leading the Lannister Guard against various bandit incursions. Some said he had taken a keep by force near the borders of the Riverlands. Others claimed he had gained a new seat of power bestowed by Lord Tywin. Arthur listened carefully, moving from small town to small town, adopting whatever guise was necessary to remain inconspicuous. The man who had once been known across the realm for his shining armor now wore tattered woolens and a hooded cloak. He looked like a weathered traveler, a bit leaner than before, the silver in his hair hidden by grime and the shadows of his hood. Only his eyes betrayed him, for they still had that intense, leonine focus. In a dingy tavern at the edge of the Riverlands, Arthur first heard the solid lead he needed. A pair of farmers spoke of how Gregor Clegane was terrorizing local villages, claiming they harbored outlaws or refusing to pay the correct taxes. The men shook their heads, their fear palpable, as they described the gruesome things the mountain did to anyone who defied him or even looked at him the wrong way. Arthur's heart pounded. It was the same brutality, the same unbridled cruelty that had taken Elia's life. It seemed that no one was safe. The farmers offered no solutions, only despair. Arthur quietly paid for their alish, bowed his head in thanks for the information, and departed into the chilly evening. The vow still burned within him. He spent the next several weeks tailing the route of Gregor Clegane's men. He heard accounts of raids, of small folk being dragged out of their homes, of innocent men forced to confess to banditry or harboring bandits, only to be slain anyway. Word had it that Gregor was enacting the will of House Lannister, though the official line was that his was a lawful authority, to stamp out unrest in the region. Arthur found it difficult not to let his anger control him. When he saw the twisted, blackened remains of a farmstead that Gregor's men had burned, he sank to his knees in the ash and prayed silently for the warrior's guidance. He touched the hilt of dawn, still wrapped and hidden at his side, and he whispered the names of Elia's children. Then he moved on. Eventually, as though guided by fate, Arthur learned of a specific location where Gregor was rumored to be resting his men. An old keep on the outskirts of Riverrun's domain had been seized. The rightful lord had died in the war, leaving the keep's small garrison leaderless. Gregor took it by force and installed himself there. Rumors said the place was called Stoneford Hall, a modest fortification by the banks of a minor river. It was now the seat of the mountain's terror in the Riverlands, a place from which he launched raids and hunts for alleged rebels. Arthur decided that this would be where he would confront Gregor. He had no illusions of an easy victory. He knew Gregor Clegane was a monstrous man, nearly 8 feet tall and built like a battering ram. But Arthur had faced imposing foes before, and skill had always tipped the scales in his favor. The real challenge would be getting the mountain alone or in a situation where Lannister guards would not intervene. Arthur was but one man, still healing from old wounds, though time had largely mended his physical injuries. He had also lost the sense of purpose that had once guided him as a Kingsguard. The vow of loyalty to the crown was gone, replaced by a vow of vengeance. It was a vow he took no pride in, but it was all that remained. Under the cover of night, Arthur scouted Stoneford Hall. It was not a grand castle, but it was defensible, with stone walls around its courtyard and a squat main keep. From a distance, using only starlight, Arthur counted the guards. Gregor's men, easily distinguishable by their rough manner and the casual cruelty they displayed, strolled along the walls or sat around campfires. There were at least 24 of them. That was too many for a frontal assault. Arthur watched the place for 2 nights, studying the changing of the guards. He saw Gregor once, towering over his men like a bear among wolves. Even from afar, the man's presence was like a dark cloud. When Gregor paced across the courtyard, men shrank away. Arthur guessed that if the mountain decided to kill any one of them for sport, no one would lift a finger in protest. The terror Gregor inspired was absolute. On the 3rd night, Arthur was crawling along the banks of the shallow river behind the keep, hoping to find a sewer outlet or drainage channel that might allow him surreptitious entry, when he heard distant screams. Peering through the reeds, he saw torchlight flickering in the courtyard. The screams belonged to a man bound to a post. Gregor stood before him, helmetless, his huge shoulders blocking much of the torchlight. Even from that distance, Arthur could see the broad strokes of the mountain's sword. One stroke, a terrible wet sound, and the screams ended. Arthur's fists clenched around the wet reeds. He could do nothing but watch from afar. Vengeance might be sweet, but it demanded patience. In that moment, his resolve hardened anew. Arthur discovered, late that night, a small drainage grate at the rear of the keep's wall. It was large enough to slide through if one had the right tools to remove the rusted iron bars. Arthur waited until nearly dawn, when watchmen were at their most weary. Then he crept up to the grate and carefully pried loose the bars with a short crowbar he had acquired in the nearest village. The metallic scraping sounded deafening in the quiet. He paused every time he made a slight noise, heart pounding, certain that a guard would poke his head over the wall. But no one came. After a tense hour, the bars came loose enough for him to wriggle through. He emerged in a damp corridor that reeked of rot and stale water. In the gloom, he felt his way along, moving deeper under the keep. It was a slow, nerve-wracking journey. The corridor connected to a small storeroom that had once been used to keep provisions, but was now abandoned. Arthur set foot inside, letting his eyes adjust to the meager torchlight flickering from somewhere beyond. He needed a place to hide until the evening, when he might have a better chance of cornering Gregor alone. Luck was with him. The storeroom was quiet, thick with dust and cobwebs, and it had a half-rotten door that looked rarely used. Arthur hid himself there, slipping behind some disused barrels. Weariness overcame him, so he dozed in fitful spells, though every snap or scuttle of rats set his nerves on edge. He dreamt of Elia's face, of Rhaegar's voice, of the white cloak he once wore that symbolized purity of service. When he awoke, the torches had been replaced, but there was still no sign of guards. He wondered if the keep staff had fled or been killed. When the twilight came, Arthur readied himself. He ran his hands over Dawn's hilt, the familiar star-forged steel that had once guided him to greatness. He could almost hear the sword sing in anticipation. The House Dayne motto, "For he who holds the sword must be worthy," rang in his mind. He clenched his jaw. Was vengeance a worthy cause? Perhaps not, but justice was. And if no one else in the realm would hold Gregor Clegane accountable, then Arthur Dayne would. Arthur slipped out of the storeroom and into the winding passages of Stoneford Hall's lower level. He moved with a silent grace that belied his knightly training. Though he lacked proper armor, he wore boiled leather beneath his tunic, enough to provide some minimal protection. The rest would rely on speed and skill. The building was eerily quiet. Occasionally, he could hear voices echoing from above, men talking about board guard duty or the crates of spoils they had taken on a recent raid. More than once, Arthur had to duck into a shadowy alcove to avoid a patrol. Once, 2 guards nearly walked right past him, and he could smell their stale ale and hear them complain about how the mountain had demanded more whippings. Arthur let them pass. He continued his stealthy climb, step by step, until he reached the main floor, where a hall of stunted arches led into a half-ruined great hall. In that space, by the orange glow of a half-dozen torches, Arthur finally saw Gregor Clegane up close. Gregor was seated at a long, rough-hewn table, devouring a massive meal. Meat bones littered the table before him. Flanking him were 4 men of equally foul demeanor, though they seemed like children beside his enormity. A cask of ale had been tapped, and the men drank heartily. One joked about the whimpering sounds a young stable boy had made before Gregor took off the boy's hand for allegedly stealing bread. Arthur stood in the shadows, feeling sickness coil in his stomach. This was the man who had crushed Elia's children, who had snuffed out her life. This was the man protected by the Lannisters, free to commit brutalities in the name of the crown. Rage threatened to unravel Arthur's composure. But he could not simply stride in and attack, for there were 4 men with Gregor, and at least that many beyond the hall. He needed a moment to isolate the mountain. Arthur decided to wait. With painful patience, he watched as the men guzzled ale and jeered. Over the next hour, one by one, the other men got up and left. Some to check on the guards, some to answer the call of nature. Gregor continued to eat and drink, unstoppable in his gluttony. Finally, Gregor himself rose, scattering bones and half-eaten chunks of meat across the floor. He belched loudly, wiped his mouth on the back of a massive hand, and turned toward a corridor that presumably led to his chambers. Arthur slipped into the corridor's gloom ahead of him, careful to remain unseen. He found a door that stood ajar and darted inside. It was a small side room, filled with cleaning supplies and some battered suits of armor. He pressed himself against the wall and waited. Footsteps approached, each one making the floorboards creak. Gregor's size made his gait a heavy, uneven thump. Arthur waited until the man passed, then he emerged and followed. Gregor reached a thick wooden door at the end of the corridor. He opened it and torchlight spilled out. Inside was a large bedchamber that looked as though it had once been the Lord's quarters. Now it was a filthy den dominated by a bed that creaked under Gregor's monstrous bulk. Arthur crouched and listened, waiting for Gregor to dismiss any attendants. But the man seemed alone. This was Arthur's best chance. He gripped on, took a breath, and swung the door open, stepping into the room in one fluid motion. Gregor was seated on the edge of the bed, pulling off his boots, and turned sharply at the intrusion. His brows knitted in confusion before anger lit his face. "Who in the 7 hells?" he began, but Arthur did not speak. He let the door swing shut behind him, drew Dawn, and leveled the sword at Gregor in challenge. The torchlight glimmered on Dawn's pale steel. Gregor rose to his feet, towering head and shoulders above Arthur. "Are you mad, you fool?" Gregor snarled, his voice thick with fury. "Do you know who I am?" Arthur's voice was quiet, but ice-cold. "I do. You are Gregor Clegane, the butcher of children." Gregor blinked, then recognition dawned, though perhaps not fully. "You're one of those damned knights come to avenge some slight? Another bug for me to squash. I've killed your kind before, boy, Arthur did not correct him on the matter of his age. He simply said, "You murdered Elia Martell and her children. You murdered the defenseless. For this crime, I have come for you." Gregor snorted, a contemptuous laugh that made the torchlight flicker with the force of his exhalation. "Elia Martell? That Dornish whore? You're too late. I've no regrets about that. Her brat squealed like a stuck pig before I cracked her skull." Arthur's entire body coiled. In the past, he might have reigned in his anger, but now he let it fuel him. "Draw your sword, Clegane," he said. "No Lannister gold can shield you from my blade tonight." Gregor's lips peeled back in a grotesque semblance of a grin. He lurched forward, grabbing for the massive sword that lay against a chair. He lifted it with casual ease. Arthur took a step back, bracing himself for the onslaught. Gregor wasted no time in exchanging barbs. He rushed forward like a raging bull, swinging that great sword in a brutal arc. Arthur slid to the side, letting the blade slice the air near his shoulder. He countered with a thrust at Gregor's flank. But Gregor's speed was surprising for a man of his size, and he twisted, letting Arthur's thrust clang off his armor. Sparks flew. The mountain barked a laugh. They circled each other in that cramped chamber. Gregor's sword was too large to maneuver easily in tight quarters, yet he seemed to have adapted. His overhead blows came with bone-crushing force. Arthur gave ground, making sure to remain just a hair's breadth away from the monstrous strikes. He knew that even a glancing blow from Gregor could prove fatal. Dawn felt alive in his hands. He parried a sideways slash, then darted in with a thrust, aiming for Gregor's armpit where the armor was weaker. The blade bit steel but couldn't penetrate fully, and Gregor slammed a gauntlet fist into Arthur's side, knocking him to the ground. Arthur rolled instantly, knowing Gregor's follow-up strike was incoming. The great sword slammed into the floor, splintering wooden boards, sending shards flying. Arthur had already rolled beneath Gregor's extended arm, slicing at the man's wrist. Steel grated on steel, and Arthur felt the jolt up his arms. Gregor grunted, but there was no cry of pain. The man was near impervious, it seemed. At last, they broke apart, each breathing heavily. Gregor's face shone with an unholy glee, as if he relished the challenge. Arthur's own features were set in grim determination. The mountain lunged again, sword raised overhead, intending to cleave Arthur from collar to hip. Arthur stepped in, impossibly close, inside Gregor's guard, and sliced upward with Dawn. A short, controlled slash that was meant to find the gap in the armor at Gregor's shoulder. But the angle was awkward and Gregor twisted in time. The blow caught the edge of his pauldron and glanced off. Gregor answered with a vicious slam of his forehead into Arthur's face. Arthur saw stars and felt warmth on his cheek. His nose might have cracked. He staggered back, and Gregor hammered at him, forcing him against the chamber's wall. Arthur ducked the next blow, which crashed into a wooden support beam behind him. The beam cracked, and part of the overhead loft groaned. Taking advantage of Gregor's sword momentarily stuck in the splintered wood, Arthur thrust Dawn forward with all his might. The blade slipped beneath Gregor's breastplate and scored his hip. A roar of pain resounded off the stone walls. Gregor wrenched his sword free, swinging wildly in a rage. Arthur just managed to dodge, dropping to a knee. He brought Dawn up, blocking Gregor's downward strike. The force jarred Arthur's arms, and for a moment he wondered if his bones would break. He pivoted away, letting Gregor's momentum carry him forward. The giant almost stumbled. They fought across the chamber, crashing into furniture, toppling a table, scattering plates and goblets. The clang of steel on steel was deafening. At one point, Gregor slammed Arthur against the bed frame, trying to pin him and crush him with raw strength. Arthur twisted free, leaving a deep slash across Gregor's forearm, but also receiving a glancing blow to his ribs. Pain flared, but Arthur grit his teeth. He could not fall now, not after coming this far. The duel raged on for long, brutal minutes. Both men bled. Gregor had small cuts on his arms and legs, each oozing red that stained his armor. Arthur had a trickle of blood from his temple, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Dawn felt heavier with each passing second. Gregor continued to spew curses. "You fight well," he growled, "but no man can best me. I'll feed you to the crows after I smash your skull." His voice dripped with the same cruelty that had haunted Arthur's nightmares. Arthur thought of Elia, of her children, and found renewed strength. Arthur feigned a stumble, letting his shoulders sag. Gregor, sensing victory, lunged. He swung his sword in a fearsome overhead strike, intending to cleave Arthur in two. But Arthur was no novice. He sidestepped at the last instant, bringing Dawn up in a precise, diagonal slash that caught Gregor at the juncture where his helm would meet his gorget, if he had been wearing one. Gregor's armor there was ill-fitted or incomplete. Dawn sliced in deeply. A horrific spray of blood arced across the room. Gregor's eyes went wide. He let out a gargled sound, dropping to one knee. Arthur wasted no time. He twisted Dawn free, reversed his grip, and drove the blade again, this time aiming for Gregor's exposed neck. With a final, savage thrust, Dawn slid through flesh and bone. Gregor's roar choked into a wet rasp. He toppled to the floor, his massive body shaking the room like a felled oak. For a moment, Arthur stood there, panting, blood trickling down his face and arms. He stared at the giant's corpse. Gregor Clegane was dead. Arthur's mind struggled to grasp the enormity of it. The monster who had haunted the realm, who had brutally slain Elia Martell and her children, who had terrorized so many villages, now lay in a spreading pool of blood. Arthur had done it. Justice was served, or vengeance, or both. But there was no time for reflection. The clash had been far from silent. Arthur could already hear shouts from beyond the chamber door, the heavy tread of boots on the corridor floor. Gregor's men were coming. If Arthur stayed, he would be overwhelmed. He sheathed Dawn and spared one last look at the monstrous corpse. A final wave of anger, sorrow, and relief washed over him. Then he fled, kicking open a side window that led to a courtyard roof. The window was narrow, but Arthur forced himself through, ignoring the jabs of splintered wood. He landed on a sloping slate roof just as half a dozen men burst into the chamber behind him, shouting curses. They would see Gregor's body and know what had happened, but by then Arthur would be gone. Scrambling along the rooftop, Arthur jumped down onto a lower wall. He nearly lost his footing but managed to cling to a rough patch of stone. He dropped into the courtyard, ducking behind a stack of crates. The men in the keep were alarmed now, streaming into the courtyard with torches. Arthur crouched in the darkness, waiting for an opening. Two men rushed past him, oblivious to his presence. As soon as they turned the corner, he sprinted for the gate. A guard stood there. He remembered Elia's gentle laughter, the way she would hold her children's hands. He remembered his vow to protect them. He had failed then, but maybe tonight he had righted that wrong in some small way. He was too drained to feel triumph. All he felt was a dull, hollow ache where grief and anger had lived for so long. He would have expected the hush of the night to bring some sense of closure, but instead, he discovered that the kill itself did not magically heal his broken spirit. The realm was still rife with cruelty. Elia and her children were still gone. The only difference was that the monster responsible no longer drew breath. Arthur contemplated the ramifications. House Lannister would undoubtedly put a bounty on his head if they realized the Sword of the Morning still lived. Or perhaps they would assume some nameless avenger had done the deed. In either case, Arthur was now an outlaw in truth, more so than he had been before. He had no illusions about the Crown's reaction to the Mountain's death. Men like Tywin Lannister would be furious. Still, as Arthur wiped the blood from Dawn, he felt a faint stirring of resolution. He had done what the laws of men had failed to do. No one else had the courage or the means to hold Gregor Clegane accountable. He alone had stood before the beast and slain him. In the distance, lights glimmered, likely men on horseback with torches combing the area. Arthur knew he had to keep moving. If they caught him in this weakened state, he would not survive. He forced himself to stand, biting back a groan at the pain in his ribs. Dawn, lighter than most swords, still felt like a weight upon his soul. He began to trudge along the riverbank, heading south. Each step was agony, but he pushed onward. He had learned enough about stealth in the months spent hiding from Robert's regime to ensure he left no obvious tracks. Whenever he heard hoofbeats, he froze, blending into the shadows among the reeds or behind rocks. Once, a torchlight glowed so close that Arthur could see the silhouette of a rider scanning the river, blade in hand. Arthur held his breath, pressing himself against the damp mud. Eventually, the searchers rode on, cursing the darkness. He found a shallow crossing and waded through, letting the cold water numb his sore legs. On the far side, the terrain rose to a gentle slope covered in thick grasses. He climbed until he found a small ridge. From there, he looked back at Stoneford Hall. Torches lit the entire perimeter, and the walls crawled with men. He couldn't hear their shouts, but he knew they were looking for him. He turned away and continued into the night. By dawn, Arthur had put many miles between himself and the keep. Exhaustion weighed on him. The pain in his ribs stabbed with every breath. He needed rest and medical attention. He found a secluded copse of trees near a trickling stream and sank to the ground, propping himself against a trunk. He tried to wash away some of the blood with the stream water. His reflection looked back at him in the ripples, haunted eyes, face smeared with grime. He did not recognize the man he had become. It took all his will to not drift into a dark stupor. He kept repeating to himself, "It is done. Gregor is dead." Eventually, sleep claimed him. When he awoke, the sun was high, and the day was bright. The warmth on his face did nothing to alleviate the aches that racked his body. He forced himself upright. In the daylight, he could see the gash on his temple, crusted with dried blood. His ribs felt bruised or cracked, but at least he could still walk. That would have to suffice. He had no immediate plans, no direction. It struck him that his life's purpose, as twisted as it had become, had been to slay Gregor Clegane. And now that was done. What next? He thought of Starfall, of the family he had left behind. Perhaps he should return. Ashera might still be there, though rumor said she had disappeared after the war, possibly flinging herself into the sea. Arthur felt a pang of sorrow. He thought of Dorne, of the Martells, of Prince Doran and Oberyn, and how they had longed for justice for Elia. Perhaps they would want to know that justice had finally been served. Arthur imagined riding to Sunspear, kneeling before the Martells, presenting them with the news of Gregor's death. Perhaps that would bring them some measure of solace. Yet Arthur was certain that Tywin Lannister would retaliate harshly if he discovered who had delivered the blow. This could lead to further strife, more violence. He found himself torn. Telling the Martells might endanger them if the truth spread too openly. And yet, keeping the deed secret felt like a disservice to Elia's memory. He needed time to think. He spent the next few days limping southward, moving mostly at night. He foraged what he could from the land, trapping rabbits and gathering wild onions. Eventually, he reached a small hamlet near the edge of the Riverlands and the Crownlands. He purchased some supplies under a false name, using a few of the coins Stark had given him. The hamlet was abuzz with rumors. A fearsome man called the Mountain had been slain in Stoneford Hall, said the local gossip. Some claimed it was the spirit of the Kingsguard seeking revenge. Others said it was a band of outlaws. The local folk were full of speculation but short on facts. Arthur kept his hood low, silently confirming that none recognized him. The name Dayne was not mentioned, which was a relief. He quietly listened as a local merchant recounted how the Lannisters were outraged, but rumors suggested that some lords, especially in Dorne, quietly rejoiced. Arthur finished his ale, pulled his cloak tighter, and departed. For a time, he traveled in that quiet, anonymous fashion, a wounded knight with no sigil. He avoided major roads, skirting large towns. He knew that word would spread, and Tywin's wrath would be swift. Indeed, not a fortnight later, Arthur passed a caravan of refugees who said that a band of Lannister soldiers was scouring the Riverlands for a killer. Some whispered that the soldiers were demanding fealty from local lords, forcing them to reveal the presence of any suspicious travelers. Arthur realized he could not remain in the region much longer without risking capture. The thought of being captured, being forced to face Tywin, was nauseating. In earlier days, he might have welcomed an honorable death. But he felt no desire to submit to Lannister justice. Better to keep moving. The question remained, where would he go? Dorne was home, but it was also home to many ghosts. Had Ashera truly died? The rumors about her disappearance cut him deeply. Lady Ashera had been close to Elia Martell as well, and the tragedy of the war had burdened her with unbearable grief. Arthur's heart grew heavy at the thought of facing what remained of his family. But he also longed for a measure of peace, if peace were possible. He was no longer a Kingsguard, no longer bound to the crown. He was simply a man carrying a great burden of guilt and sorrow. The idea of returning to Starfall, or at least to Dorne, began to take root. Perhaps, after delivering the news of Gregor's demise to the Martells in secret, he could fade away into the desert sands. One evening, he came across a small group of Dornish merchants camped by a stream. They were clad in bright silks, with wagons full of fine carpets and spices. The sight of them felt like a piece of home. Arthur approached carefully. At first, they regarded him with suspicion. But when he quietly asked for news of Dorne, they relaxed. An older merchant with a trimmed mustache offered him a bit of flatbread and chickpea stew. Arthur ate, grateful. The warmth of Dornish spices reminded him of the feasts in Sunspear years ago. The merchants told him that Prince Doran Martell was in mourning, still reeling from the war's aftermath, but that Oberyn Martell, his younger brother, had been restless. Oberyn had traveled to Essos, had fathered children, and had earned the moniker the Red Viper. He chafed under the peace with the Iron Throne, hating the Lannisters for what they had done to his sister. The merchants added that Doran was more measured, preferring to bide his time. They said no one truly believed that Elia's death had been avenged, nor that Oberyn would ever stop seeking some form of justice. Arthur listened in silence, a swirl of conflicting emotions in his chest. When one merchant asked if Arthur was heading to Dorne, Arthur hesitated. Then he said, "Yes, I have family there, and I wish to pay my respects to House Martell." The merchant nodded sympathetically. They offered Arthur a place by their fire for the night. Arthur accepted, though he remained cautious, revealing as little as possible about himself. As they sat around the crackling flames, sipping spiced wine, the merchants exchanged tales of the realm. One of them asked if Arthur had heard the rumor that the mountain was dead. Another merchant spat, "Good riddance. The man was a monster. If only someone had killed him sooner." Arthur said nothing, staring into the dancing flames. By dawn, Arthur thanked the merchants and parted ways. He had decided he would travel to Sunspear. He would find a way to speak to Prince Doran or Prince Oberyn in private. He would tell them what had happened, that Gregor Clegane was slain by Arthur Dayne, that justice had finally been done for Elia. He hoped they would keep the secret, or at least not spread it widely. But above all, he felt they had a right to know. Perhaps it would bring them some solace. So he began the long journey south. The trek across Westeros was fraught with danger for a lone man with no official status. He dodged Lannister patrols, avoided main roads where the Crown's men might be present, and only occasionally dared to stop in villages for supplies. His injuries took time to heal, but with each passing day, he felt his strength return. Dawn remained at his side, the symbol of the House Dayne legacy he carried. In moments of doubt, he wondered if his father or ancestors would approve of his actions. Had he acted as a knight should, or had he simply unleashed his anger upon a vile man, succumbing to vengeance rather than honor? Winter gave way to a mild spring, and Arthur traversed the Reach, then skirted the edges of the Stormlands, all while hugging the mountainous regions that bordered Dorne. He traveled mostly at night, resting in hidden hollows during the day. The wind grew warmer as he went south, and the scents became familiar. The dryness of the desert, the tang of the sea air. At last, after weeks of cautious travel, Arthur stood on the edge of the Prince's Pass, looking down upon the red mountains and sun-baked stones of Dorne. A wave of conflicting emotions threatened to overwhelm him. This was home. He had not returned since the rebellion ended, since his world shattered. He descended the pass, moving through narrow switchbacks. He encountered a few Dornish patrols, men bearing the sun and spear sigil. He told them he was a traveler seeking to pay respects to House Martell for the war's losses. The guards looked him over suspiciously, noting his battered equipment and well-worn cloak. Yet they seemed less hostile than Lannister or Baratheon men might have been. Perhaps they recognized something in his accent or his bearing. But he was not detained. They let him pass, warning him to keep the peace in Dorne. He bowed his head, murmuring gratitude. The journey to Sunspear took another fortnight. Along the way, he saw the deserts, the rocky outcrops, the cacti, and the winding rivers that occasionally carved green valleys through the red land. Memories of his youth flashed through his mind. Sparring with his siblings in the courtyard of Starfall, the bright banners fluttering in the Dornish breeze, the laughter at feasts. Now he traveled incognito, a phantom of the past. The thought of walking openly into Sunspear made his heart pound. But he pressed on. When he at last beheld the tall spear-shaped towers of the castle city, shining in the southwestern sun, he felt a tremor go through him. He was nearing his final confrontation with the past. Sunspear was well guarded, but Dorne was not in active rebellion, so the gates were open to travelers. Arthur joined a small line of merchants, wearing a scarf over his head to hide his features from the blazing sun and from prying eyes. The city beyond the gates was bustling with life. Market stalls full of fragrant spices, bright silks, exotic fruits. Dornish men and women in light garments bustled to and fro. Arthur discreetly made his way to a modest inn near the castle walls. He paid for a small room, used what was left of his coin to secure some fresh garments, and tried to wash off the dust of the road. In the mirror of polished metal, he saw a lean man with tired eyes. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper than before. A few more strands of silver had found their way into his dark hair. He scarcely recognized himself, yet he still carried Dawn carefully wrapped. He stowed the sword in his room while he scouted the city for a means of reaching the Martells. He knew he could not simply stroll to the palace gates and demand an audience with Prince Doran or Prince Oberyn. He had no official standing, no invitation. He was presumed dead or at least exiled, but perhaps an old contact still resided in Sunspear. Years ago, Arthur had known a steward who served the Martells, a man named Corin Wade. Corin was half Dornish, half Westerlander, and had always shown Arthur courtesy. If Corin still lived in Sunspear, he might help arrange a secret meeting. Arthur asked discreet questions around the city. It took a few days, but eventually he learned that Corin Wade was indeed still in service, though now as a mid-level official overseeing the palace's daily operations. Arthur managed to approach the steward in a quieter section of the castle courtyard. At dusk, Arthur wore his scarf and hood, so Corin initially did not recognize him. Arthur spoke softly, "Corin, it's me." At the sight of Arthur's face, the steward's eyes went wide, mouth open in shock. He murmured, "Sir Arthur? Gods be good, everyone thought you." Arthur hushed him, looking about to ensure no one overheard. Corin stammered, "I had heard so many rumors, Ashera, Lord Dayne. They said you died at the Tower of Joy." Arthur nodded gravely, replying, "I need your help, Corin. I must speak to Prince Doran or Prince Oberyn in private. No one can know I am here." Corin paled but agreed. His loyalty to House Dayne and to the memory of the Honorable Kingsguard apparently outweighed any fear of the consequences. He whispered instructions for Arthur to come to a certain side gate of the palace complex at midnight. When the appointed hour arrived, Arthur followed the directions carefully. He found Corin waiting by an unremarkable wooden door set in the wall. Corin led him through narrow servants' passages. The stone corridors were dimly lit by sparse torches. Arthur's heart pounded with each step, memories flooding him of the last time he had walked these halls while accompanying Prince Rhaegar or Princess Elia. How the world had changed. Finally, they reached a small antechamber off the main hall. Corin bade Arthur wait while he spoke to Prince Doran. Arthur nodded, pulling his hood lower, though there was no one else in sight. After several minutes, Corin reappeared, accompanied by a slender man in fine Dornish robes, leaning on a cane. It was Prince Doran Martell. His hair had grayed at the temples, and his face bore lines of sorrow and caution. When his gaze fell upon Arthur, he inhaled sharply. He moved closer, leaning heavily on his cane, eyes brimming with unspoken questions. Arthur pulled back his hood, letting the torchlight fall across his face. The prince stared, mouth slightly open. "Sir Arthur Dayne," he said in a hushed voice, "my sister spoke often of you. We thought you perished. The realm believed it so." Arthur bowed his head. "Your Grace, I owe you many apologies, for failing to protect your sister, for vanishing without word. I am undeserving of your welcome." Prince Doran's expression flickered with pain at the mention of Elia. He drew in a slow breath. "Elia's death was not your fault. We all were ensnared by the tides of war." There was a long pause, as though he were gathering strength. "Why have you come here now, after all these years?" Arthur looked up. His voice was low, almost trembling. "I have done what should have been done long ago. Gregor Clegane is dead. By my hand." Prince Doran's eyes widened in shock. He took a step back, as though reeling. His knuckles turned white on his cane. You killed the mountain?" Arthur nodded. "He will trouble Dorne, and the realm no more." For a moment, Prince Doran seemed unable to speak. Emotions warred on his face. Grief, relief, anger, sorrow. Finally, he managed, "You have done a great deed, though the consequences, my brother Oberyn has dreamt of that monster's death for years." Arthur bowed again. "I did not come for praise. I came to tell you so that Elia's family would know, and so that you might prepare for any retaliation from the Lannisters." Doran swallowed, nodding. "Lord Tywin will be enraged. But the question is, does he know who dealt the blow?" Arthur hesitated, then said, "It was done in secrecy, but the Lannisters may suspect someone with skill. They have men searching." Doran's gaze sharpened. "You must stay hidden or flee Dorne. They will not rest until you are found. But, I confess, I am relieved to know my sister's murderer has met a bloody end." There was a trembling in his voice. He took a deep breath. "Oberyn will want to see you." Arthur felt a stir of unease. The Red Viper was known for his passionate nature and fierce loyalty to Elia. Would he rejoice, or would he be enraged that he had not been the one to kill Gregor himself? Arthur nodded. "As you wish, your grace." Corin quietly slipped out of the chamber to fetch Oberyn. Doran motioned for Arthur to sit, indicating a stone bench along the wall. Arthur sat, feeling the weight of his journey. Doran lowered himself onto another bench, leaning on his cane. The silence between them was thick. Finally, Doran spoke softly. "She cared for you, you know? My sister. She always said you were a true knight." Arthur's throat constricted. He wanted to reply, but words failed him. Doran's eyes glistened. "I only wish... The gods are cruel," he whispered. Before Arthur could respond, the door opened, and Oberyn Martell strode in, as lithe as a panther. He wore flowing Dornish robes, a golden sun brooch pinned at his shoulder, and an intensity in his dark eyes that was palpable. He stopped short upon seeing Arthur, tilting his head. "By the Seven," he murmured. "So the rumors are true." Arthur stood to greet him, but Oberyn crossed the room in a few swift steps and clasped Arthur's shoulders. "Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, returned from the grave? This I did not expect." Arthur stiffened, not entirely sure how Oberyn would react. "My prince," he said quietly, inclining his head. Oberyn looked him up and down. "You look like a man who has walked through hell and back. Why return now?" His tone was challenging, but there was a hint of curiosity rather than accusation. Doran answered for Arthur, softly. "He's come to tell us that Gregor Clegane is no more." Oberyn's eyes widened, a slow smile curving his lips. He released Arthur's shoulders and stepped back, letting out a soft, disbelieving laugh. "Oh, you have done what I swore one day I would do." His laughter held an undercurrent of mixed emotions. "So you have avenged my sister, then?" Arthur nodded, meeting Oberyn's gaze. "I am sorry you did not have the chance yourself, but I could not let him live." His voice trembled slightly. "Forgive me if I have robbed you of your vengeance." Oberyn stared, then gave a wry chuckle. "If I harbor any resentment, it is that I did not get to see his face in the moment of his death." He exhaled, raking a hand through his dark hair. "But well done, Sir Arthur. You have done a service to all of Dorne, and indeed to the entire realm." Doran cleared his throat. "We must be cautious. Tywin will seek retribution if he learns of this. If they discover Sir Arthur—" Oberyn waved a hand dismissively. "We owe Tywin nothing. He is a snake. Still, we must tread carefully. The Lannisters have power and wealth. They will not let this pass easily. But at least that brute is gone." He turned to Arthur, expression more serious now. "What will you do, sir? Return to Starfall? Stay in Sunspear?" Arthur hesitated. "I have not decided. I do not wish to bring trouble upon House Dayne or upon House Martell. Perhaps it is best I vanish again." Oberyn frowned. "Nonsense. You're a hero to me, at least. But I understand your caution." He glanced at Doran, who nodded in agreement. Doran spoke gently. "You are welcome here, if you wish to remain. I cannot guarantee your safety if the Lannisters discover you, but my men will not betray you. Or, if you prefer to return to Starfall, you may. House Dayne still stands, though your brother has struggled with the burdens of rule." Arthur looked at Doran sharply. "My brother? Is he well?" Doran pressed his lips together. "He grieves. The war cost us all dearly. Ashera, we do not know for certain what happened. Some say she ended her own life. Others cling to hope she still lives somewhere, far away. But your brother is alive. If you wish to see him, you will find him at Starfall." The news made Arthur's chest tighten. He had dreaded hearing about Ashara's fate. Now that dread mixed with a faint glimmer of hope. Perhaps he could learn the truth by returning home. But the shame and guilt he felt about the war, about failing to protect Elia, weighed heavily. Still, something in him longed to see Starfall's white towers again, to feel the sea breeze from the Torrentine River. He nodded slowly. "I think I should go home. I've been away too long." Doran gave a sad smile. "I will arrange for safe passage discreetly. Oberyn and I will do what we can to conceal your presence from the Lannisters, at least for a time." Oberyn placed a hand on Arthur's arm. "Thank you for what you have done. My sister's memory may rest a little easier now that her killer is in the ground. But let me warn you, Tywin Lannister and his spawn are cunning. They may not rest until they discover who killed his dog." Arthur inclined his head, acknowledging the warning. "I will be careful." He hesitated, then added, "I only regret not saving her in the first place." Doran sighed. "We all have regrets, but life goes on, Sir Arthur. And sometimes, there is still honor to be found." With that, the prince offered a small, weary smile. "Will you join us for a quiet meal? I would hear more of your journeys, away from curious ears." Arthur glanced between them, a swirl of emotions within him. Though it felt surreal, he was among friends, Elia's family. He felt a measure of solace in their acceptance. "Ah, yes, your grace. I would be honored." And so, in a small, private dining room within the palace, Arthur sat with Prince Doran and Prince Oberyn. They shared a simple meal of spiced vegetables, roasted goat, and Dornish red wine. The conversation was subdued, punctuated by moments of reflection. Arthur recounted some of his wanderings, though he omitted certain details that might incriminate Eddard Stark or reveal too much about how he had evaded Robert's men. Oberyn, for his part, was fascinated by the final fight with Gregor and pressed Arthur for every detail. When Arthur described the monstrous strength of the mountain and how he had barely survived, Oberyn only grinned fiercely. "I wish I could have seen your blade pierce his neck. The gods cheated me of that sight." Arthur offered a faint smile, though he felt little joy. After the meal, they retired to an inner courtyard. A warm evening breeze carried the scents of lemon trees and flowering vines. Lanterns flickered in the arches, casting dancing shadows across the tile floor. Dayne turned to Arthur. "We will make arrangements for you to travel to Starfall within a few days, once we have a secure plan. Until then, you may rest here in secrecy." Arthur bowed. "I am grateful, and please, my princes, be wary. The realm is not gentle these days." Oberyn tilted his head. "We are Dornish. We have ways of handling the realm's cruelties." There was a glint in his eye that spoke of his well-known cunning, honed in the free cities and on the sands of Dorne. Arthur believed him. That night, Arthur was given a small chamber in a secluded wing of the palace. Corran brought him fresh clothes, and Arthur took his first real bath in many weeks, scrubbing away the grime of the road. He tried to let the hot water soothe his aches. When he sank into bed, the softness of the mattress felt alien. His dreams were turbulent, filled with the memory of Gregor's final roar, the shriek of metal on metal, the sight of blood, and the face of Elia. But amidst the nightmares, he also dreamt of the Dornish sky at dawn, bright and full of promise. He saw faint glimmers of hope, though he dared not trust them fully. In the following days, he remained mostly confined to his chambers at Dayne's insistence. A few trusted servants brought him meals. He spent his hours either resting or pacing the small space, feeling a caged tension. He was not used to idleness nor to hiding, but he understood the need for secrecy. Once, Oberyn visited him, and they spoke at length about the days before the rebellion, recalling lighter times. Arthur sensed Oberyn's underlying anger and sorrow, the legacy of Elia's brutal death. But there was also a certain acceptance in Oberyn's manner, as if the slaying of Gregor had finally lifted the heaviest burden from his soul. Dayne, true to his word, arranged a caravan under the guise of merchants traveling to the Torrentine region. They would have official letters from House Martell, ensuring they were not to be trifled with along the way. Arthur would travel with them as a guardsman, wearing light armor and a half-helm that obscured his face. Dawn would remain hidden beneath blankets in one of the wagons. Arthur felt uneasy about disguising his ancestral blade, but it was safer than carrying it openly. On the day of departure, Dayne and Oberyn met Arthur in the small courtyard at dawn. The sky glowed pink over the palace walls. Dayne placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder and said quietly, "Safe travels, Sir Arthur. If the day comes that you are once more willing to stand openly, know that Sunspear will welcome you." Oberyn gave a curt nod, adding, "You have avenged my sister. You will always have my gratitude. But be careful." Arthur thanked them both, feeling an unexpected warmth in his chest. He had come to deliver vengeance, yet somehow he was leaving with a measure of peace he had not anticipated. The caravan left Sunspear by the main gate. Arthur was clad in simple leather armor, carrying an unremarkable longsword at his side to avoid suspicion. As he approached the gates, 2 Dayne guardsmen halted him, demanding his name and business. Arthur's throat was dry. He slowly unwrapped a portion of dawn, revealing the distinctive pale blade. The guard's eyes widened. One of them took a step back, almost dropping his spear. Sir Arthur?" he stammered. The other guard, a younger man, looked astonished and confused. "You were said to be dead," he whispered. Arthur swallowed, voice hoarse. "I need to see my brother. May I enter?" The guards glanced at each other, then stepped aside, bowing, clearly stunned. Arthur walked through the gates, into the courtyard where he had once sparred as a youth. Servants and guards stopped in their tracks, whispering in disbelief. Arthur felt the weight of so many eyes on him. He ignored their stares and made his way toward the great hall. Inside, the hall was cool and quiet. A steward hurried forward, face pale with shock. He managed a bow, stammering, "My lord will see you at once." Arthur nodded, feeling a strange sense of unreality. He followed the steward through corridors hung with tapestries depicting the Dayne lineage, scenes of legendary knights brandishing dawn against the darkness. It all felt like a memory from another life. Finally, they reached a smaller solar. The steward stepped aside, gesturing for Arthur to enter. Arthur took a steadying breath and walked in. His brother, Dayne, sat behind a desk strewn with papers. Edric looked older than Arthur remembered, with lines of care etched into his brow. His once black hair was streaked with gray. At the sight of Arthur, Edric rose so quickly his chair toppled. For a long moment, neither spoke. Edric's eyes were wide with shock, and there was a tremor in his voice when he finally spoke. "Arthur, gods be good. Is this a dream?" Arthur's voice almost failed him, thick with emotion. "It's me, Edric. I'm sorry it took me so long to come home." Edric rushed forward, and they embraced. Arthur felt his brother trembling against him. "We all thought, Ashera and I, we feared the worst." At Ashara's name, Arthur tensed, and Edric drew back, sorrow in his eyes. "She is gone. I have tried to find the truth, but all I have are rumors that she threw herself into the sea. Others claim she fled. I do not know." Arthur closed his eyes, the confirmation of his worst fears sinking like a dagger into his chest. "Ashera," he whispered. They stood in silence for a moment, grieving. Then Edric composed himself. "Sit, please. We have much to discuss." Arthur sank into a chair, setting Dawn within reach. Edric began to pace, as though he could not contain his swirling thoughts. "Where have you been all this time? How did you survive? And the realm? They say the mountain is dead. Rumors swirl that a mysterious night killed him. Was it you?" Arthur nodded wordlessly. Edric's pacing halted. He stared at his brother, face filled with a turbulent mix of awe and anxiety. "So it is true," he murmured. "Gods help us, Arthur." Arthur gave a small nod, an ache in his ribs reminding him of the brutal fight with Gregor. "It had to be done, Edric. He murdered Elia and her children. I could not live without." His voice trailed off. Edric exhaled, shoulders slumping. "I understand. I only fear what this will mean for us if the Lannisters learn you live and are here." Arthur understood well. House Dayne might be dragged into conflict with House Lannister, or worse, the Iron Throne itself. He closed his eyes. "I will leave if it puts you in danger, Edric. I came only to see if there was anything left of my family. I did not wish to bring trouble upon you." Edric placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "You are my brother. You belong here. If I have to defend that choice, then so be it. But let us be cautious. We can keep your presence quiet, at least for a time. The folk of Starfall are loyal. And if the rumor that the mountain was killed by some unknown knight continues, perhaps Tywin will look elsewhere." Arthur nodded, overwhelmed by his brother's acceptance. "Thank you." He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. Will you tell me about Ashera? Anything you know?" Edric's expression tightened with pain. He recounted how rumors spread that Ashera, grief-stricken after the war, had jumped from a cliff near Starfall. Some said it was because of her lost child. Some said it was heartbreak over the tragedy at the Tower of Joy. Others that she was cast aside by someone in King's Landing. Edric had never found a body, and he clung to a thread of hope. Arthur listened, feeling as though his heart was being squeezed. He had feared the truth would be grim, and it was. Another life lost, another casualty of the madness that had gripped the realm. They spoke long into the night, sharing stories. Edric updated Arthur on the state of House Dayne, how the lands had been taxed heavily after the rebellion but had mostly recovered. They had sworn fealty to the new king, Robert Baratheon, to keep the peace. Dorne was officially part of the realm, yet tensions simmered beneath the surface, especially among those who mourned Elia. Arthur felt a pang. The realm's wounds had not fully healed, and perhaps never would. In the days that followed, Arthur remained within the walls of Starfall, rarely venturing outside except at night. He refamiliarized himself with the keep, the library, the training courtyard. Some of the older servants who remembered him as a boy or as a newly knighted Kingsguard wept at the sight of him, as though seeing a ghost. Arthur graciously accepted their kindness but kept to himself, wrestling with the swirl of emotions. He visited the cliffs where Ashera was said to have leapt, standing at the edge with the sea crashing below. He whispered a farewell to his sister, tears in his eyes, uncertain if she could hear him in the afterlife. He prayed to the seven, though he felt as if the gods had long abandoned him. Still, the presence of Dawn at his side and the support of Edric gave him a glimmer of stability. He had avenged Elia, and now he was home, though scarred in ways no one could see. Weeks turned to months, and in that time, Arthur learned to live quietly within Starfall's shadows. Edric devised excuses for why Arthur rarely appeared in public, telling those who asked that the rigors of war had left him frail, that he needed solitude. Arthur spent many hours in the library, researching old histories, as if seeking some deeper insight into the cyclical nature of vengeance and war. He also trained with the castle guard at night, his skill a quiet legend among them. A hush always fell when he entered the yard, and the men treated him with awe. But Arthur discouraged adoration. He no longer believed in the shining illusions of knighthood. He believed only in duty, and in the simple fact that some evils could only be stopped by steel. Rumors from the outside world trickled in. The Lannisters, as predicted, demanded answers regarding Gregor's death. They claimed that bandits or outlaws must have done it. Some said Tywin believed the Dornish were involved, though he had no proof. Oberyn and Doran played a delicate game, feigning innocence while quietly celebrating. Robert Baratheon was said to be preoccupied with feasting and tournaments, more interested in pleasure than in a renewed conflict. Life went on, the realm teetering between alliances and grudges, while Arthur Dayne remained hidden in the fortress of his ancestors, nursing his wounds in body and soul. Yet for all the quiet nights and the murmur of the Torrentine River far below, Arthur could not entirely escape the haunting echoes of the past. Sometimes, in the hush before dawn, he would wander to the ancient tapestry hall, where images of past Dane knights holding dawn in glorious battle were immortalized. He would stand in the flickering torchlight, looking upon those figures of legend, and wonder if he was worthy to bear the sword any longer. He had used dawn to shed the blood of a monstrous man, to fulfill a vow that was half justice, half vengeance. The sword, forged from the heart of a fallen star, had once symbolized the dawn of hope. Arthur wrestled with whether hope could still be found in such a broken world. But then he would recall Elia's voice, gentle and kind, urging him in his memories to remember the true purpose of knighthood, to protect, to stand against cruelty. Though he had failed her once, he had avenged her, preventing Gregor from harming others. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it was the best he could do, given the realm's cruelties. The passing days blurred, and seasons shifted. Arthur found a fragile peace at Starfall. He and Edric reconnected as brothers, sharing the weight of their grief for Ashera and for all that had been lost. On rare occasions, a messenger came from Sunspear bearing discreet letters from Prince Doran, informing Arthur of the realm's changing winds. Never did those letters mention his name, only cryptic references to the dawn and the mountain. Arthur would read them in private, then burn them. Thus Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, faded into quiet seclusion, a living legend in the fortress of his forebears. Across Westeros, tales abounded about who had slain the mountain. Some claimed a vengeful spirit, others a band of mercenaries, still others an unnamed Dornish champion. Only a chosen few knew the truth, and for a time Arthur was content to let it remain so. He had carried out the vow that had consumed him. Gregor Clegane's monstrous reign ended in a puddle of his own blood, by the blade of dawn-forged steel. Yet deep in Arthur's heart, he could not completely quell the lingering sense that his story was not done, that the realm's troubles would once again call him from the shadows. But whether that day would come soon or in a distant future, he did not know. For now, he would accept the fragile solace of home, the quiet murmur of the Torrentine, and the memory of Elia's sweet smile that reminded him some sliver of honor yet lived in this land. And should the world need the Sword of the Morning again, it would find him at Starfall, the pale blade sheathed in peace but ready to rise in justice. Until then, he would keep watch, a lonely sentinel in the night, awaiting a dawn of better days.